"Can I clean your mansion for a plate of food?" But when the CEO millionaire saw her, he froze. "Please, I don't want charity." Emily's voice trembled over the clatter of raindrops splashing on the stone driveway of the mansion in Boston. Lightning flickered through the iron-wrought gate as she pressed the intercom button, burying her face in the soaked, golden strands of hair plastered to her forehead. "I only ask if I can clean your house for a plate of food for my daughter." Inside, Alexander Thorne, 37, CEO of a major real estate firm, stared at the monitor from the security room. His jaw tightened when he saw the child clinging to her mother. The girl wore a wooden beaded bracelet identical to one he had once given his daughter Lily before the accident. His breath caught. He pressed a button and the iron gates wheezed open. Emily stepped through the entrance, holding Rosie, her tiny frame shivering. She set her shoulders, eyes full of fear and fierce resolve. When she met Alexander at the front hall, his voice was clipped and measured. "What do you want?" Emily steadied her voice. "Just a meal for my daughter. I will do any work you need, just a meal." She straightened, drenched but proud. Alexander looked down at Rosie's small, pale face. Thunder rumbled faintly in the chandeliers overhead. He stepped aside and said softly, "Enter. The child needs to eat." Emily led Rosie into a dimly lit guest corridor lined with classical portraits. Alexander followed silently. He watched them reach a modest guest suite off the east wing. Without a word, he turned and walked back up the marble stairs. Within minutes, Alexander returned and placed a small bundle outside their doorway, a tiny sweater and trousers for a child, soft socks rolled together. No note, only that precise gesture. Emily hesitated before picking them up, glancing at Rosie's pale cheeks. She dressed her daughter, whispered, "Eat now," and gently laid her on a spare cot to rest. Alexander climbed the curved staircase to his private study, clutching a framed photo of Lily. The vision of Rosie wearing the same bracelet tore at him. His palms trembled. Outside the guest room, Emily sat on a low stool beside Rosie's bed, feeding her a container of warm broth. Rosie sipped slowly, eyelids fluttering. Emily brushed crumbs from her lips and wrapped the child in the fresh sweater. She whispered, "Thank you," though she doubted her words would reach anyone. Above, Alexander placed the photo back on the desk, his face unreadable yet unsteady. He stared out the rain-streaked window pane, past the gardens that held Lily's favorite lilacs as memories threatened to spill into the silence. Rosie stirred, murmured something small and drifted into sleep. Emily stayed close, brushing her hair from her face. She held the bundle of clothes, then rose and slipped quietly into the hallway. She paused at the threshold, bowed slightly, and without looking back said, "Thank you for letting us stay." No answer came. Emily closed the door softly behind her. Alexander stood on the landing above, eyes fixed on the closed door. He pressed his hand against the cool banister. Rosie's breathing steadied, soft in the hush of the night. Emily gathered the empty bowl, careful not to rouse her. She slipped out into the corridor, pausing under a faint beam of moonlight filtering through the stained glass. The gates were still open behind her, but she would not return out into the storm. Within his study, Alexander closed his eyes and pressed the framed photo against his heart. Lily's laughter echoed in his memory, bright, unguarded, irreplaceable. He set the photo gently down and sat before a dusty wooden chest beside his desk. He lifted the lid to reveal Lily's beaded bracelet matching Rosie's. He touched the beads as though touching Lily again. His lips trembled with a bare whisper. Why did no one tell me she'd come back like this? The mansion settled around him, empty but full of ghosts. Alexander rose, stepping to the balcony above the foyer, looking down at the silent hallway. Somewhere beyond the walls, Emily and Rosie slept. He closed his eyes, rain still pounding against the windows, and felt something shift in him, a crack between grief and hope, broken open by a mother's plea and a child's bead bracelet. The scent of lemon-scented polish mingled with the faint smell of rain as Emily moved quietly through the hall, rag in hand, wiping down the carved banister of the Thorne Estate's grand staircase. It had been 2 days since that stormy night when she had first arrived at the gate with Rosie in her arms. She had not asked to stay longer, only to earn their keep with work. Alexander hadn't said much since letting them in, but he hadn't asked them to leave either. Rosie played quietly nearby, with a cloth doll Emily had sewn from an old t-shirt. The girl still looked thinner than she should, but color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes followed her mother with sleepy curiosity. When Alexander entered the foyer with a muted step, Rosie looked up and tilted her head. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging at Emily's shirt. "It's the man with the sad voice." Emily turned, startled. Alexander paused mid-stride. I'm sorry," Emily said quickly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "She didn't mean any offense. She notices things." Alexander's expression didn't shift, but his gaze lingered on Rosie longer than usual. "Children often do," he said, then moved past them and disappeared into the library. That night, as Rosie slept, curled in a guest bed far too large for her tiny frame, Emily sat nearby on the rug, mending a small tear in Rosie's only jacket. The bedside lamp cast a warm glow, catching the fine strands of her golden hair as she worked. She felt a lump in her throat. There was something surreal about sitting in this mansion, warm and safe for the first time in weeks. Just 3 weeks ago, they had still been living out of the rusted van parked behind a gas station. The engine had died during the first frost of the season, and with no job, no savings, and no family to call, Emily had wrapped Rosie in layers of old sweaters and sung lullabies to her over the hum of passing trucks. It had been the lowest point, lower than when she left the nursing job after her supervisor began making inappropriate advances and the hospital administration chose to look away. Lower even than the day Rosie's father left, slamming the apartment door without once looking back. Emily had not cried then, but now, in the quiet comfort of this stranger's home, her eyes welled with something hot and unfamiliar. Relief, maybe, or guilt for feeling relief. When she finally laid down beside Rosie, pulling the blanket over them both, she noticed something on the nightstand. A small tray with a cup of warm milk and 3 shortbread cookies. Rosie was fast asleep, unaware. Emily frowned. She hadn't heard anyone enter. She picked up the cup. It was warm to the touch, a quiet kindness. She looked toward the door, now closed. The next morning, Emily swept the kitchen floor while Rosie sat at the breakfast nook, coloring with the set of old crayons Alexander had placed on the counter. Emily hadn't asked for them. She hadn't needed to. Alexander appeared briefly, nodded, and left with his phone pressed to his ear. No questions, no lectures, just that quiet presence, moving through the house like a shadow. Later, as she tucked Rosie in for a nap, the child whispered, "He looks at you like he's thinking of something sad." Emily smoothed the child's curls, then sat in the corner, uncertain how to answer. That evening, as dusk settled over the estate, Emily stood by the kitchen window watching the twilight creep across the lawn. She didn't know why Alexander had allowed them to stay. She didn't know what he saw in Rosie's bracelet, or why he had placed milk and cookies beside the bed without a word. She was grateful, but wary. People with that kind of money, they didn't help without reasons. Still, he had not asked her anything, not even her last name. Upstairs, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the fire. His fingers traced the grooves of the beaded bracelet on his desk, the twin of Rosie's. Her laughter from the kitchen echoed faintly up the halls. It was a sound he had not heard in years, not since Lily. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and in that breath, he remembered what it was like to come home to the sound of a child's voice. Not his child, not anymore. But maybe something close. The mansion was quiet in the way only grief can silence a home, thick, unyielding, and patient. Though grand in its architecture, Alexander Thorne's estate felt more like a mausoleum than a place of living. Every corridor echoed with memories, none louder than those left behind by the small girl whose laughter once filled these halls. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the accident. Alexander stood at the threshold of the upstairs nursery, his hand gripping the doorframe. He rarely entered the room. The walls, still painted in soft lilac, bore fading murals of clouds and birds. Her bookshelf remained untouched. Stuffed animals were frozen in place, forever waiting to be hugged. Lily had been 7, curious, sweet, with a wild affection for purple orchids. She used to draw them constantly, on napkins, on receipts, even on the walls. One of those drawings, smudged and taped crookedly on the refrigerator door, was still there. He couldn't bring himself to remove it. The day she died, he had been on a flight to London, finalizing an international deal. Her mother, his ex-wife, had called him after the crash. Her voice had been frantic. "I thought you knew she was with me," she'd sobbed. He hadn't known, and he hadn't said goodbye. Since then, Alexander had buried himself in work, expansion, acquisitions. Numbers and reports were easy, predictable. Emotions were not. He had built an empire atop his silence. It was safer that way. But now, Rosie's voice, so much like Lily's at that age, was seeping through the cracks. That morning, while Alexander reviewed documents in his study, he heard soft footsteps upstairs. Emily had been cleaning, likely tidying the guest rooms. He let it be. She was careful, respectful, until he heard the creak of the nursery door. His pulse jolted. By the time he reached the room, Emily was standing by the small white bed, holding a pale blue pillow in her hands. The fabric was torn at the seam, exposing a clump of stuffing. "What are you doing?" His voice was sharper than he intended. Emily jumped, startled. I'm sorry," she stammered, placing the pillow down gently. "It was torn. I was just going to mend it." "You shouldn't be in here," he said, the edge in his voice like broken glass. She bowed her head. "I didn't know. I truly didn't mean to intrude." He didn't respond. The room was too full of ghosts. That night, Alexander returned to the nursery after Emily and Rosie had gone to bed. The pillow was back in place, neatly sewn. A small note lay on top. "I'm sorry for touching something sacred. I only meant to help. Emily." His fingers traced the stitches. They were careful, tender. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, the pillow in his lap. For the first time in years, tears slipped down his cheeks. Not loud, just there, lingering, like the weight he never allowed himself to release. Downstairs, Emily paced in the kitchen, unsure if she had overstepped, but something about the look in Alexander's eyes, when he had found her holding that pillow, had spoken of a pain deeper than anger. A man who had locked the door on grief and thrown away the key. The next morning, he appeared at the kitchen threshold as she poured Rosie a bowl of cereal. "I have more rooms that could use cleaning," he said, not meeting her eyes. You're willing to stay another week?" Emily looked at him, surprised. "Of course. Thank you." "It's easier having someone in the house," he added, more to himself than to her. "Rosie, she makes it feel like it used to." Emily gave a soft nod, understanding without needing every word, and though neither of them said it aloud, something shifted in that moment, a quiet agreement, not of debt nor of charity, but of healing, halting, hesitant but beginning. The garden had long gone untended. Ivy crawled lazily along the stone path, and wildflowers bloomed wherever they pleased. Once manicured hedges had grown soft and uneven. Alexander rarely came out here anymore. The place had been Lily's favorite. Now it was just another reminder. But Rosie had claimed it like it belonged to her. Each afternoon, while Emily cleaned or folded laundry, Rosie would run barefoot through the yard, laughing at butterflies and trying to name flowers in her toddler's vocabulary. She loved the fountain, even though it had stopped working long ago. She called it the Whispering Water. Sometimes Emily would sit beside her and teach her simple rhymes, tracing the words in the dirt with a stick. That morning, Alexander stepped into the sunlight for the first time in weeks. He had come outside searching for something, maybe air, maybe quiet, but found Rosie instead. She stood beneath the old apple tree, arms stretched toward a low-hanging branch. Her little fingers couldn't quite reach the fruit. Alexander hesitated, then walked over. Without a word, he picked the reddest apple and offered it to her. Rosie took it with wide eyes, then, unexpectedly, wrapped her arms around his legs. "Thank you, Mr. Sad Voice," she said softly, resting her head against his knee. Alexander froze. "Rosie," Emily called from the porch, flustered. She jogged down the steps, eyes apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she said, gently pulling her daughter back. She likes to name people." Alexander looked down at the apple still in Rosie's hand, then back at Emily. "It's all right," he said. His voice was low, not cold. "She says your voice sounds like someone missing a song," Emily added, smiling shyly. "I told her some people carry quiet in their hearts." He did not know how to respond to that. Later they sat in the kitchen as Rosie napped upstairs. Emily peeled potatoes, and Alexander, for once, did not retreat to his study. "You know," Emily said, glancing sideways, "before all this, I worked at a nursing home, night shifts mostly. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked listening to the residents talk about the past." "What happened?" Alexander asked. Her hands paused. "A supervisor started cornering me, saying things he shouldn't. When I reported it, they said I made it up. I walked out that day." There was a silence. "And Rosie's father?" he asked gently. "Left when I was 3 months pregnant," she said simply. "Never called, never looked back." Alexander's brow furrowed. "That's unforgivable." Emily shrugged. "I stopped waiting to understand it. Rosie was born in the back seat of our old van. The first thing she did was scream, loud and strong. That sound kept me going." He watched her as she sliced the last potato, her movements steady, purposeful. "You're stronger than you realize," he said quietly. That evening the rain returned, soft this time, like a lullaby on the roof. Emily and Rosie curled on the living room sofa, wrapped in a knitted blanket. The fireplace crackled faintly. They had fallen asleep, Rosie's tiny body nestled against her mother's side, Emily's arm curled protectively around her. Alexander came downstairs for a glass of water, but stopped when he saw them. He did not move closer. He simply stood in the hallway, watching. The soft rise and fall of their breathing, Rosie's little hand tangled in Emily's shirt, the way Emily's face, even in sleep, looked ready to wake at the slightest sound. He stayed there a long time. Then, quietly, he turned off the hallway light so it would not wake them and returned upstairs. He could feel it, something he had not allowed himself in years. A warmth, delicate and dangerous. He was starting to care, but care was a risk. And the last time he had loved without restraint, it had broken him. Still, as he lay in bed, the image of Emily and Rosie lingered behind his eyes. He closed them, and for the first time in years, sleep came not as an escape, but as a place where their laughter followed him into dreams. The storm arrived without warning. By early evening the sky had turned the color of iron, and rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the tall windows of the Thorne estate. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, but inside the lights still glowed warmly. Until they didn't. At precisely 7:08 p.m., the entire house blinked into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator stilled. The security lights went dead. In the silence that followed, only Rosie's soft gasp broke through. Emily stood near the kitchen, holding a flashlight. "Well," she said with a calmness she didn't quite feel, "I guess it's going to be a candlelight kind of evening." Rosie clapped her hands. "Like a camping trip." Within minutes, Emily had placed a few candles on the coffee table. Their small flames flickered against the glass, casting a warm golden light across the living room. She wrapped Rosie in a blanket and sat with her on the rug. Alexander joined them, uncertain, holding a thick book of poems in one hand. He hesitated near the doorway. "Come on," Emily said, patting the floor. "We don't bite," Alexander chuckled, sitting down stiffly. The candlelight softened his features, erased the sharp lines that usually etched his face. "Tell us a story, Mommy," Rosie chirped. Emily leaned back, her smile playful. "Okay. Once upon a time there was a tiny hedgehog who wanted to fly. As the story unfolded with wild exaggerations and silly voices, Rosie giggled uncontrollably, her laughter filling every corner of the room. She rolled onto her side, howling with joy when Emily mimicked a hedgehog trying to build wings out of leaves and string. Alexander watched her, stunned. It was not the sound of laughter that undid him, but the shape of it, the way Rosie's nose wrinkled, the little gasp between giggles. It was exactly how Lily used to laugh. His hands trembled. Emily finished the story, laughing herself now, and looked over. Her smile faded. "Are you okay?" Alexander blinked. He hadn't realized the tears had come until one slipped down his cheek. He looked away quickly, but his voice cracked as he said, "I haven't heard that sound in 4 years." Emily said nothing. She waited. "My daughter," he said after a long pause. "Her name was Lily. She was 5. She died in a car accident. I was at a meeting across the country. I wasn't there." Emily's eyes softened. "I'm so sorry." "I've tried," he said, his voice hoarse. "Tried to forget, or bury it, or work so much that it stops hurting. But sometimes I see Rosie and I feel like I'm drowning again." Emily moved closer, not touching him, just enough that their shoulders almost met. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that pain ever really leaves? Or does it just need someone willing to carry a piece of it with you?" Alexander looked at her then, really looked. Candlelight shimmered in her eyes, and for a moment he saw not a struggling single mother or a temporary guest, but a woman who had known loss too, and chosen love anyway. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the steady rhythm of rain. Later, Emily fell asleep on the couch, Rosie curled beside her. Alexander stood and gently draped a soft wool blanket over her shoulders. His hand lingered for a second, then withdrew. He looked down at them, a family without trying to be. He stepped back into the shadows of the hall, but the warmth remained in his chest, stubborn and unfamiliar. He did not sleep much that night, but for the first time, he didn't fear the dreams. The piece shattered with a single headline. It appeared first on a gossip blog. Cheap font, grainy photos, and a cruel title. Billionaire CEO playing house with homeless maid. But by morning, the story had spread like wildfire. The front gate of the Thorne estate was swarmed with reporters. Emily watched in horror from behind the living room curtains as microphones were shoved through the bars. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. Is it true she was living in a van? Did she trap you, Mr. Thorne? Is the child yours? Rosie whimpered at the chaos. Emily pulled her close. Alexander, calm but furious, stepped in front of the cameras. "This woman," he said, voice steady and deliberate, "is the reason my daughter smiles again. She is the reason I remember how to breathe." His eyes swept the crowd. "And if any of you ever call her a gold digger again, you'll be hearing from my lawyers." The press froze. Inside, Emily sat in stunned silence. She had not expected him to defend her so publicly, so fiercely. That afternoon, James Mallory, Alexander's oldest friend and the only person who had dared to stay in touch over the years, showed up unannounced. He walked through the kitchen like he owned the place, stopped in front of Alexander, and raised an eyebrow. "You look different," Alexander smirked. "That bad?" "No, that alive." They sat in the study, a fire crackling quietly in the background. James glanced at the candle on the desk, then at the open notebook of Lily's drawings. "So she did it," James said. "She got through." Alexander sighed. "I did not plan for this. I let them in thinking it was temporary. But now," Rosie laughs, and I swear I hear Lily in every sound. "Emily looks at me like I'm not broken, and I want to be the man she thinks I am." James leaned back. "Then be him. Lily's gone, Alex, but you're not. You get to choose if her memory becomes your anchor or your wings." Alexander stared into the fire for a long moment, then nodded. Later that evening, while Rosie napped and the house grew quiet again, he found Emily folding laundry in the guest room. He hesitated at the door, then stepped in, holding something small. "I wanted to give you this." He handed her a wooden box, plain on the outside, but carefully carved. Inside was a thin, faded book. The cover was soft with age, the title almost rubbed away. The Adventures of Pinecone Bunny. "Lily's favorite," he said. "She made me read it every night, even when she memorized every word." Emily traced her fingers over the spine, gentle. "Rosie will love it." "I thought—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "You remind me of her, of Lily. You love Rosie the same way I loved Lily, maybe even more." Emily looked up, her eyes warm but uncertain. "Sometimes I wonder," she whispered, "if I'm just a replacement for the life you lost." Alexander's face softened. "You're not." He did not say more. He did not need to. His eyes said everything: gratitude, admiration, and something more fragile, hope. As she closed the box, her hand brushed his. The touch was brief, but something in the air changed. She gave him a small, cautious smile. Outside, the last of the reporters had left. The estate stood quiet again. But something had shifted inside its walls. Love was not declared, not yet, but it had begun to grow. The sun filtered through the branches of the old willow tree, casting soft shadows on the manicured lawn behind the Thorne estate. A checkered picnic blanket stretched beneath a large oak, dotted with crumbs from sandwiches and bright plastic cups. Rosie's laughter rang out as she chased bubbles across the grass, her little feet wobbling with joy. Emily sat on the blanket, barefoot, hair catching the afternoon light, sipping lemonade while watching her daughter. Alexander sat a few feet away, cross-legged, watching them both. He had never liked picnics before. They had felt staged, artificial, like photo ops for other families. But this was real. The breeze, the laughter, the slight chaos of a toddler and two people figuring out what it meant to be together. It made his chest feel warm and heavy all at once. "Careful, Rosie," Emily called out as the girl darted toward the stone path. But the warning came a moment too late. Rosie tripped over the edge of the garden path and fell with a sharp cry. Her hands scraped against the stone. Emily stood quickly, heart racing, but Alexander was faster. He reached her first, lifting the sobbing child into his arms with practiced gentleness. "Hey, it's okay, sweetheart. I got you," he murmured, brushing the dirt from her knees. Then it happened. Through the tears, Rosie clung to his shirt and cried out, "Daddy!" Time stopped. Alexander froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. Emily, halfway toward them, halted in place. For a second, no one moved. Rosie buried her face in his neck, still sniffling. Alexander slowly sank to his knees on the grass, holding her close. His arms tightened instinctively, protectively, and then, without warning, the tears came. He did not sob. He simply held her and wept quietly, the sound of her tiny voice echoing through every hollow place in him. Emily knelt beside them, her own eyes shining. She's never called anyone that before," she whispered. Alexander looked up, his voice hoarse. "I did not expect to feel this much." Emily placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Alexander, do you want to be part of our lives? Not as someone fixing the past, but as someone building a future." He did not hesitate. He nodded. "I do." Later that evening, as the house settled into its evening rhythm, Emily found a single flower on the dining table. It was a purple orchid, Lily's favorite. No note, no explanation, but she knew. It was a promise. Alexander watched her find it from the doorway. He said nothing, only met her gaze. She smiled, touched the petals, then looked back at him with a soft understanding. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep curled against her favorite stuffed bunny, Alexander sat across from Emily in the living room. The fireplace flickered low. He reached across the space and took her hand. "I do not want you to leave," he said. "Ever." Emily exhaled, her chest rising with something like relief, but also worry. "And what happens when people start asking questions again? When the press wants to know who I am to you?" Alexander looked into her eyes, his expression open, unguarded. "They will know you are the woman I trust, the one who saved my life." He paused. "And if it takes time before we tell the world everything, that is okay too." Emily nodded. "Then we stay, for now." He smiled. "Oh, for always. If you want." Outside, the garden glowed with the last light of day. Inside, in the space between grief and healing, something new had begun to grow. A family, not built by blood, but by love. The Thorne estate no longer felt like a fortress. Over the months, it had softened. The walls, once echoing with silence, now hummed gently with life. Laughter in the mornings, music in the kitchen, tiny footsteps down the hall. Emily stood by the front door, tying her shoes. Her blonde hair was pulled into a neat bun, a small stack of textbooks tucked under one arm. She looked back over her shoulder at Alexander, who leaned casually against the doorframe, sipping coffee. "Orientation starts at 10, she said, her voice laced with nerves. "You will be brilliant," he replied. "They are lucky to have you. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and stepped outside. Rosie ran after her, backpack bouncing, arms wide. "Wait! Mama forgot her lucky pen!" Emily laughed, scooped up her daughter, and twirled her in the air. Alexander watched them from the porch, his chest full. Just months ago, none of this seemed possible. Emily's dream of returning to nursing, Rosie's open, fearless joy, and yet here they were, weaving a new life one thread at a time. Inside, the living room had changed too. Gone were the stiff arrangements, the untouched corners. In their place, a play tent, a bookshelf lined with children's stories, and on the center wall, a new painting. It was Rosie's, crayon and watercolor on thick paper. 3 figures holding hands beneath a blue sky, one tall, one with a dress, and one small with curly hair. Above them, a crooked sun smiled down. Alexander had framed it himself. Family, Rosie had written in bold letters at the top. He had hung it in the living room without saying a word, but when Emily saw it, she stood still for a long moment. Her hand brushed his as she whispered, "Thank you." One rainy afternoon, they sat together in the garden, the patio umbrella shielding them from the drizzle. Rosie danced barefoot on the wet stones, giggling as raindrops kissed her cheeks. Alexander reached over, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "I used to dread the rain," he murmured. She looked at him. And now? He watched Rosie spin in circles, arms out like wings. Now it feels like a second chance. Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "I spent years fearing the next goodbye. Now I believe in tomorrows again." They sat in silence, letting the soft rain wash over their thoughts. Later that evening, after dinner, Rosie crawled onto Alexander's lap, cradling a photo album Emily had unearthed from a thrift shop project. "Tell me again," she said, pointing to a photo. Alexander smiled. "That was your first day at the zoo. You fed the goats. And screamed when one licked your hand." She laughed, burying her face in his chest. "You are the best, Daddy." He closed his eyes, holding her tight. "I had the best teacher," he whispered. That night, after Rosie had been tucked in, Alexander walked through the garden alone. The flowers Emily had planted now bloomed freely, among them a small cluster of purple orchids. He paused by them, kneeling down, fingers grazing the petals. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "I hope you like the garden." He stood slowly, feeling the weight lift, just a little more than yesterday. When he returned to the house, Emily met him at the door, barefoot and glowing in the candlelight. She reached for his hand. "We are home, aren't we?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, we finally are." And under the quiet hum of rain and hope, they stepped into the warmth together. "Pain never disappears," the story seemed to whisper, "but it softens when held by hands that choose love over fear." If this story touched your heart, if you felt the quiet ache of loss, the warmth of a second chance, or the gentle healing of unexpected love, then we invite you to stay with us. At Soul Stirring Stories, we bring you powerful tales of resilience, redemption, and the beauty of human connection. Every week we share stories that will move you to tears, leave you smiling, and remind you of what truly matters. If you believe in love that heals, families that form in the most unexpected ways, and the kind of moments that linger in your soul, then please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that might just change your day or your life. Thank you for watching. And remember, the most beautiful language doesn't need words, just a heart willing to listen. See you in the next story.